Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Leon Tabak. I will moderate a discussion here on the question of what is the continuing appeal of socialism. The topic was suggested by surveys taken in last year's election that found large numbers of Americans have a favorable view of socialism. To help us in this discussion, I have three colleagues here. On my left is Ayman Amer, and then Chris Lammer-Heindel, and Derek Buckaloo. So let's hear a little bit about your own backgrounds and what brings you to our discussion today. If you want to just say a few words about yourself, starting with you, Derek.
Sure. I'm a professor of history at Coe College, and I'm a specialist on the Vietnam War, but I teach a lot of 20th century topics, and in particular post-1945 subjects. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about social change and American politics and culture and society. And needless to say, there's been a lot to think about recently. So that's what brings me to today's discussion.
All right, Chris.
Yeah, I'm a assistant professor of philosophy at Loras College. And my research interests have been in with respect to state moral duties and corporate moral duties. And I'm also the chair of the Dubuque Local of the Democratic Socialists of America.
Very good. Ayman?
I teach economics at Mount Mercy, and I teach different levels of economics, starting from principles to international economics, to labor economics, sustainability and environmental classes. And I am interested in, as well, a lot of the interesting issues in today's economics, inequality and the environment and wages and labor and all of that. So
yeah, I think our topic could carry us into many areas today. And I'll say just a few words about myself. I teach computer science at Cornell College, but I also am a faculty director for what we call the McWethy Program for Economics, Business, and Public Policy. So we had a gift to the college to sponsor programming in these areas. And I have that involvement in addition to my computer science. Well, let me share with you some of our statistics and get some response from you here. So one article I read said that 6 in 10 Democratic primary voters last year believe that socialism, quote, has a positive impact on society. The survey found that people under the age of 45 preferred socialism to capitalism by a margin of 46% to 19%. A survey taken by Bloomberg and the Des Moines Register found 43% of likely caucus goers would use socialist to describe themselves, would use that word. Now these surveys need some interpretation. They're made by different groups for different purposes. So maybe some of you could help us there when we look at a survey. How might we begin to qualify it or interpret those numbers? Anybody want to offer a general suggestion how we begin when we see something like this in the newspaper?
Well, I'll start with a question about our question. We're starting with what's the continuing appeal of socialism, and of course, to an American historian, what you're struck by is how little appeal socialism has had in American culture and American life over the years. It's for a long time, the question really was how come socialism was such a non-starter in the United States compared to other developed economies, particularly in the industrial age. So in some ways it's an interesting question. I would start by saying with these poll numbers, I think it has something to do with kind of moral judgments about how socialism approaches providing human needs versus how capitalism approaches them. And so in no way is this a strict definition of what socialism is. It's more of a hunch, I think, from a lot of these voters that there are elements of human life and American life, education, healthcare, retirement, where removing the profit motive and not necessarily having those programs in private hands might lead to better outcomes for lots of Americans, particularly in the economy we find ourselves in today.
Derek, some of these surveys were commissioned by Republicans who were looking for an answer.
Yeah, I would concur. I think that the question of it raises interesting questions about how people conceive of socialism and what they have in mind when they answer these questions. And some of the surveys did explore that to some degree. One of the surveys that you cite indicated that although people, millennials in particular, would indicate high favorability ratings for just the term socialism, they would give lower favorability ratings with respect to the term state-run economy. And a lot of hay has been made of that, like that they don't know what they're talking about. And I think that's overstating the case. I think, as Derek suggested, it does probably, I'm inclined to suppose that it might express some values, the values that they associate with socialism, they find favorable. Some particular policy issues, there might be more significant disagreement. And what I take away from this is that people are more receptive to a mixed economy, an economy where there are certain programs that very, very much embody socialist values and principles. And I believe I've read that something like 58% of people favor a single-payer healthcare scheme, for example. So in certain industries, I think there is a clear sense that we favor programs that we associate more with socialist values. But in terms of other policies, a state-run economy, broadly conceived, Americans are still
lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah, Americans are still, resistant to that sort of approach.
I think I will offer this. I was born in Cairo, Egypt, and we had a socialist government for a very long time, until I graduated from college. The system was somewhat corrupt, because that's what happens when you give bureaucrats too much power. On the other hand, I think there is two things to say about this historical or part of history that we live in today. That is the fall of communism in about 1990, 1991, 92. And that was thought of in some circles as the end of that Marxism or communism or socialism. And I thought that was too quick to say that. And I think that we have been under to a large extent, free market rules for a very long time. And the thinking that this is the only alternative, meaning free market versus capitalism, communism or socialism, that was not the end of that, because there is a point of view that there are certain services, as you just spoke of, education, healthcare, other issues, environment, labor rights. There are changes in the union participation. There are changes in the power of the unions. A lot of people in the US and many other countries in Europe feel that the system has peaked in some way in depriving groups of society of what they consider their rights. So I think that's why I see this reaction.
And the reaction to that can run both right and left. I think both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were arguing, against a middle that their voters largely saw as not delivering on what might have been promised, or the American dream, or the variety of ways to say that. Just in response to Ayman's example of Egyptian socialism during his upbringing, I would just note that there are a variety of versions of this, and not all of them are associated with corruption. The social democracies of Europe are among the least corrupt countries on the planet, and of course many critics of the US system would suggest that corruption in Washington, D.C. is actually a problem. It takes a different form than corruption in lots of places. But there are a lot of different ways to compare that in terms of kind of what that looks like.
There is also the corruption that not with the bureaucrat side, but also in the corporation side, which is also, I think, part of the underlying reasons for these surveys, or the responses, is that people have felt that the business have so much power in influencing the rules and the laws. There is the market that I talk about in my classes, and there is the who makes the rules. So
And
who
banks-
makes the rules
Banks too large to fail.
as well?
You know.
So
But
the
there's-
banks, the
so there
corporations.
seems to be a contradiction there, though, because people are complaining about corporations. Well, when corporations have allied themselves with government, I mean, the corporation by itself doesn't have very much power. It's small compared to the size of the government. It's only when it succeeds in getting Congress to pass a law that protects it, favors it, subsidizes it, and so on, that it begins to exercise this power, and we lose choice as consumers and citizens. Is that fair to say?
I think that is true, but it is. I think a lot of people do recognize that power has grown so much bigger than it used to be. Power of the influence of the business community onto the legislation or the decision making or the policy making. And that is part of it's not right and left, it is establishment versus non-establishment.
You wanted to say something?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I would say that we also don't want to set up socialism as simply synonymous with big government. What we have is a big government in some respects that is very pro-corporate interests. And I think what is coming out here is this idea that perhaps people are interested in what would it look like to have a government that was more authentically for the people, the natural people, not the artificial corporate people, and by the people. And would that be big government in some ways? Probably. In other ways, though, not. I mean, we have a very large, I think, misleadingly labeled defense industry, where there's, it's not collusion. It's official. It's above board. But we have massive defense industry companies that benefit from government activity in various sorts of ways. And rethinking that, like, what would it be if instead of devoting all of those dollars and all that energy to defense and weapons manufacturing and deploying that equipment overseas in wars, what would it look like to shift to social services, to these social democratic policies, like universal health care, Medicare for all. So it's not just big government versus not big government for socialists. Socialists are opposed to certain kinds of big government.
And to put it in some historical terms, I mean, there's no question that the equation has changed between corporate power and government power. And you can date it from a variety of places, but you can do worse than starting in 1971 when Lewis Powell, a corporate attorney who would soon be on the Supreme Court, wrote his famous Powell Memorandum, which basically has been described as the revolt of the bosses. It actually described the business executive as the forgotten man, and it urged organized business and corporations to move into politics and move to Washington, D.C., and to affect the rules of the game. And they did this in immense numbers. So this is the birth of the modern lobbying industry. It's the birth of Washington, D.C. being awash in money. And we have some clear studies that suggest that what Congress and the government does aligns largely with the interests of the wealthy and corporations and does not align with public opinion polls about what most Americans would prefer. There are all kinds of issues where 60% or 70% of people would like to see something happen, but it's a non-starter and we get nowhere near that. Lots of this has to do with money in politics, and I would suggest it's part of the sense of loss of control or things getting worse that both Trump and Sanders focused on. But since Citizens United, that decision associating money with free speech and things like this, the political system is even further from any form of kind of pure test of what the American people would like to see. The money really does affect what goes on in the government. And that, and of course, corporations have an immense benefit with regard to that. They outspend unions and nonprofit lobbying by about 34-1 in Washington, D.C. I mean, those are immense numbers.
And I looked at numbers for the contributions to campaigns by all of these different sectors in the economy, and Citizens United did allow much less regulated role for the corporate money in influencing decision making.
I think one of the things that resonated with Sanders' campaign is his persistent message that if we do value democracy in the political sphere, when we take stock of our situation with Citizens United, the vast wealth inequality, and I don't think vast wealth inequality is itself necessarily problematic, but in a system where money is speech and money is influence, that's a real problem. If you want democratic political institutions, we need to democratize the economy a bit more, or there needs to be change somewhere in that system. And I think that resonates. I know it resonates with my students. They're very concerned with this.
So the two things I saw that prompted these polls, I think, were the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. I think 25 years ago, when he first entered Congress, he was kind of the exception that proved the rule. He was people would make some lighthearted remarks about the woolly-haired socialist from a hippie state and a college town, and it just seemed to be the exception that proved the rule, that nobody could be elected and call himself a socialist. Now, last year he called himself a democratic socialist and made some distinction there, and maybe we want to explore that, how he was able to overcome whatever previous impediments a socialist might have faced. The other prompt for these surveys was the financial crisis of 7 or 8 years ago, where the United States government put lots of money into saving and paying the obligations of private corporations, automobile companies, banks, and so on. So maybe we comment there a little bit about Bernie Sanders and what he did for the word socialist in 2016.
I can get us started on that, I suppose. I mean, I would be the first to acknowledge, and this is sometimes talked about in articles about Sanders, that from a policy perspective, Sanders' policies are what we would more properly call social democratic policies. Okay. You mentioned like in the Scandinavian countries and whatnot. There's broad appeal for those, as we sort of mentioned, some of those, especially healthcare. What I think people find interesting is that for him it's grounded in these more socialist values. And then the question is, so what is that? And we'd have to crack open his book, perhaps, and one of his books, and figure out how he describes his values. As a democratic socialist myself, I would say that socialism, democratic socialism, is principally, on the one hand, a critical perspective, a critique of capitalism, and the belief that the profit motive, while good in many ways, it increases technological development, productive capacity, creating a surplus. It gives rise to problems that it can't solve. Like the ecological crisis is one that a lot of people are very concerned with. It's not clear how free markets can actually prevent us from tapping out natural resources, just given market dynamics. So there's a critique of capitalism, that it gives rise to problems that it can't solve, but then it has democratic socialists have a positive project. So what's the alternative? And socialists differ in terms of what that looks like. But what we seem to all have in common is this belief that if we could, in some ways, bring the vast number of people who could benefit from unleashing the productive capacity of the economy, redirect surplus to benefit them, if we put the means of production in their control in some way, that this would produce a fairer economy, a fairer system that would contribute to human need. I think they see that in Sanders. I think people see those values and they find those values inspiring, and they can identify with those. But it has created some slippage between social democracy and social democratic programs and democratic socialist values and programs. And there's going to be some divergence. Social democratic programs don't really ultimately challenge capitalism. I think of unemployment insurance, right? Corporations benefit from unemployment insurance. We pay our bills even if we fall off the employment rolls. We don't see in Sanders or any other Democrats any sort of fundamental challenge to the capitalist order. But there's this interest that's developing, and we'll see how that plays out.
With regard to Bernie Sanders, he was a socialist as a college student, so he came to socialism himself personally very early. But the debate can be had whether his legacy is really in that line of what we might call socialism in some way, or his line is really from the New Deal through the Great Society to the present. I mean, the Democratic Party has a tradition of building social welfare programs. They're not as developed as in most of the countries of the rest of the developed world, but those exist. With regard to his campaign recently, I think his continued claim that he was a socialist was part of his brand, kind of a truth-telling honesty. And given that he had long used that phrase in Vermont politics and that kind of thing, he stayed with that. And I think it attracted a lot of support. On the other hand, you described Bernie Sanders as a success, and certainly he went much further than many people thought he would in 2016. But needless to say, he did not get the nomination, and he's not the President of the United States. And one of the questions about him in the general election scenario was whether his identity as a socialist would have hurt him in a general election. It certainly didn't hurt him among Democratic caucus goers or primary voters as a general rule. But whether that would have been difficult for him, more difficult for him in a general election is an experiment we didn't run in 2016, but it's an interesting question about American culture.
I'd like to suggest some other ideas here, maybe get you to the first one to respond to these. Some of the people who are looking at these polls are saying maybe the reason Americans accept socialism more now, or accept that word now, is because we've become socialist. And I shared with you before the program, Upton Sinclair had a quotation about this, which has been misattributed to many other people, to the effect that the American people would never vote for a candidate party that called itself socialist, but they would eventually vote for every part of the Socialist Party's program. And we've just gotten there. And the other argument is that when I was growing up, when you were growing up, we had the Cold War, and we had the example of totalitarian regimes that were pursuing socialism, and that gave us a foil that made socialism look bad everywhere. And maybe now, 25 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism, we can talk about socialism in a different way.
Yes, it's a different generation of people who did not experience what you are talking about during the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and all of that. But it is also clear that we have some critique, as Chris mentioned, to the completely free market. I would say basically there is two major points. The environment is one of them, which the private interest may or may not pay attention to, which is a resource, and the rights of the labor. And recent economic research said the rights of the share that the labor get from the output is a lot less than it used to be. If you compare that to 30 or 40 years ago, that's the most recent popular research in economics, that the labor share is much smaller.
I don't think there's any question that the end of the Cold War opened a space for some of this. I also think the sense that the American economy is failing in some way, or that capitalism isn't quite delivering the way that it should in the wake of the Great Recession, is part of this too. But you talked about, are we already socialist, or have we arrived? And I would just push back on that and say, compared to every other developed economy in the world, American workers get a relatively raw deal in terms of access to education rather than going into student loan debt, in terms of family leave policies that support families and workers during their working lifetime, in terms of the healthcare system, famously. There are millions of people who don't have access to healthcare today, and the healthcare system in the United States is much more expensive than other single-payer sorts of systems around the globe. There's also retirement, where the Republican Party is interested in raising the Social Security age and reducing the rise in benefits from Social Security when there are all kinds of people struggling to retire at all in the American system. So there are a lot of these examples of ways in which, whatever the cause, it doesn't seem to be working in a common sense justice way that makes sense to a lot of Americans, and they're looking for other solutions. Some of them look to Bernie Sanders, some of them look to Donald Trump.
So I wonder if it's easier than ever to see what's happening elsewhere in the world. So we had a big vote in Britain this last summer. We have a vote in France just 2 days ago. some of the models that people on the left in America look to overseas have made some retreat from socialism. So, for example, Sweden allows private accounts in its social security system. It allows school vouchers. They've denationalized some companies. We've seen some retreat, and I don't know if that's registered enough on Americans.
I think this is related to that. You mentioned these other trends in the world. Donald Trump is not a uniquely American phenomenon. It's interesting to think about how he figures into this global trend that we're seeing, which leads me to wonder, what is the global cause? And I suspect it might be something tied to what you're mentioning, which is like neoliberal policies and austerity and the privatization. I mean, I think that Trump, we'll see what happens in France and all these other things. I think that these might be reactions to, in a nebulous sort of way, neoliberal policies. And I would grant the premise that we're seeing the retraction of some of these programs. But I don't know if that necessarily bodes well for the future.
But do Swedes go bankrupt because of healthcare crises? Do Swedes have guaranteed time off from their jobs?
Well,
do Swedes retire in their 60s? I mean, again,
these aren't free. You have a government that makes you pay for what somebody else chooses for you. Right?
That's right, but our government already makes all kinds of choices, including all the spending on defense, all the bailing out of the banks. In other words, lots of this is about what are the government's choices, and that's why politics is the way to attempt to regain control of that system. And that's what Bernie Sanders was offering.
Part of the European realization, just like Americans recognize, that these centers of power that elect our representatives have so much more input into the decisions, both in Europe as well as here. And that's why you can see that there is very much common recognition in both sides.
Okay, we're down to our last few minutes. So let me suggest one other question for you. Anyway, this has to be your last comment here. Maybe part of what we're seeing here is young people are looking at an idealistic philosophy, and as they age and they see some of these answers have been tried before, maybe their opinions will change. So there's another famous quotation, often misattributed, that says that if we're not liberal when young, we have no hearts. If we're not conservative when we're older, we have no heads. Do you think these surveys that we've seen here are likely to change over time here? Is this a reflection of the youth at one moment, or is this a trend here?
I think things are changing.
Okay.
Because of the state of the American economy,
right.
Because of the way in which capital is amassing more and more wealth, while labor and salaries are basically flat, if not down. They're largely flat since the late 70s or the late 80s. So people are struggling with very real things: student loan debt, ability to see doctors, the ability to think about retirement. Okay. These are basic questions that I think things have been reframed quite a lot. I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Okay, so it's clear that the distribution remains a problem, and that will continue.
All right. Well, thank you we have so much more to say. Thank you for great contributions today. Thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News, and have a great week. Thank you.
Sorry, I cut you.